There comes a point in the life of every empath where the pain no longer feels temporary, not because they stopped loving, but because they finally realize they have been carrying emotional weight that was never meant to belong to one person alone. Most people never notice this struggle because empaths are experts at hiding emotional exhaustion behind kindness. They smile while silently breaking inside. They comfort others while nobody notices their own wounds. They continue giving love long after they stop receiving the same energy in return. And over time, people begin expecting this behavior as if the empath was designed to survive endless disappointment without ever changing. That is where the dangerous misunderstanding begins. Many people mistake an empath's patience for weakness. They mistake forgiveness for dependency and loyalty for permanence. The avoidant slowly becomes comfortable with emotional distance because deep down they believe the empath will always return. No matter how many conversations are avoided, no matter how many emotions are ignored, the empath continues trying to repair the connection. While one person keeps pulling away, the other keeps fighting to hold everything together. At first, the empath believes love can heal the situation. They believe enough understanding can make another person finally feel safe enough to open up emotionally. So they continue giving more time, more patience, more emotional energy. But beneath the surface, exhaustion quietly begins growing. Every ignored feeling leaves a mark. Every moment of emotional distance creates another silent wound. Eventually, the empath begins noticing something painful. They realize they are the only one carrying the emotional responsibility of the relationship. They are the one fixing the silence, fixing the misunderstandings, fixing the emotional gaps while slowly losing themselves in the process. And once that realization becomes impossible to ignore, something changes forever. The empath stops chasing, not out of anger, but out of emotional exhaustion. And that quiet shift becomes the moment everything in the relationship begins to change. One of the biggest illusions in emotional relationships is believing someone will always stay simply because they always have before. Human beings naturally adapt to consistency. When someone is constantly patient, constantly understanding, and constantly willing to repair emotional damage, their effort slowly stops feeling special and starts feeling expected. This is exactly what often happens between an empath and an avoidant. The empath becomes the emotional foundation of the relationship, while the avoidant becomes comfortable relying on that emotional stability, without fully realizing how much energy it costs the other person. The empath is usually the one sending the first message after conflict, the one trying to understand emotional distance instead of reacting with anger. The one carrying difficult conversations while the avoidant hides behind silence. Over time, this creates an imbalance that quietly grows stronger. The avoidant begins assuming the relationship will survive every disappointment because the empath always returns emotionally available. Distance no longer feels dangerous because the empath keeps closing the gap every single time. But behind the scenes, emotional exhaustion is slowly building inside the empath. Every ignored feeling creates disappointment. Every unanswered emotional need leaves another invisible crack in the connection. Yet the empath continues giving because they believe loyalty means endurance. They convince themselves that enough love, enough patience, and enough understanding will eventually change the relationship. Then something painful begins happening internally. The empath starts questioning why they are carrying the emotional responsibility alone. They begin realizing they are constantly sacrificing their own peace just to maintain connection with someone who keeps withdrawing emotionally whenever vulnerability appears. At first, they ignore these thoughts and continue trying harder, but awareness has already started growing inside them. Eventually, the empath becomes emotionally tired. The long conversations become shorter. The emotional chasing weakens. The constant need for reassurance disappears. And suddenly the avoidant feels something unfamiliar. The relationship no longer feels emotionally guaranteed. For the first time, silence stops feeling temporary and starts feeling permanent. There is a moment in every super empath's journey that changes the entire emotional dynamic of a relationship. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive through anger, revenge, or emotional explosions. It arrives quietly through emotional surrender. The empath finally realizes they cannot force another person to become emotionally available. They cannot keep carrying a connection alone while the other person continues running from vulnerability. And once this realization fully settles into their heart, the chasing slowly comes to an end. For a long time, the avoidant felt emotionally safe because the empath always stayed. Distance never truly felt dangerous because the empath kept returning to repair every emotional gap. Silence always ended with another conversation. Disappointment always ended with another chance. The avoidant unconsciously became comfortable with this pattern because it created predictability. No matter how emotionally distant things became, the empath remained emotionally present. But now something feels different. The empath no longer rushes to fix every misunderstanding. They stop explaining their feelings over and over, hoping to finally be understood. They stop seeking constant reassurance. Instead of emotional pursuit, there is calmness. And calmness from an empath can feel deeply unsettling because it signals acceptance rather than temporary frustration. For the first time, the avoidant begins experiencing uncertainty. They no longer know if the empath will return emotionally. They no longer know if another chance will appear. And that uncertainty creates emotional tension they cannot easily escape from. Suddenly, memories become louder. The avoidant begins replaying old conversations, missed opportunities, and moments where connection could have replaced distance. They start recognizing the emotional safety the empath quietly provided for so long. The patience, the understanding, the consistency that once felt ordinary now feels rare and deeply valuable. And that is the painful truth about emotional absence. People often recognize the true value of someone only after their emotional presence begins disappearing. One of the most misunderstood things about a super empath is that they can still love someone deeply while choosing to walk away completely. Most people assume detachment means the feelings disappeared, but that is rarely the truth. The empath often still cares. They still remember the connection. They still wish things could have unfolded differently. The difference is that they finally stop sacrificing themselves just to keep the relationship alive. They realize love should never require the destruction of self-respect. For years, the empath may have convinced themselves that loyalty meant endless patience, endless understanding, endless emotional endurance. They accepted emotional inconsistency while continuing to give emotional stability in return. They kept excusing behaviors that slowly drained them because they believed love meant staying through everything, no matter how painful it became. But eventually, reality becomes impossible to ignore. The empath begins understanding that love cannot survive when only one person is carrying the emotional responsibility. They realize they have spent too much time abandoning their own peace just to protect someone else's comfort. And once that awareness fully awakens inside them, the entire relationship begins changing. The avoidant often becomes confused during this stage because the empath is no longer reacting emotionally the same way. There are no desperate conversations anymore, no emotional chasing, no constant attempts to repair every silence. Instead, there is calm emotional distance, and that calmness feels final in a way arguments never did. For the avoidant, the silence becomes emotionally unsettling because there is nothing left to push against. No pressure, no pursuit, no emotional urgency, only absence. And absence forces reflection. They begin remembering the patience they once overlooked, the emotional safety they unconsciously depended on, and the consistency they assumed would always remain available. But sometimes realization arrives too late, because once a super empath truly begins healing, they stop romanticizing emotional suffering. They stop believing love requires endless sacrifice. And for the first time in their life, they begin choosing themselves instead of losing themselves trying to save someone else. There comes a powerful moment in the life of a super empath when they stop searching for validation from the person who kept making them feel emotionally uncertain. For a long time, the empath may have measured their worth through attention, reassurance, and emotional responses that arrived inconsistently. They kept hoping that one more conversation, one more effort, or one more moment of patience would finally create emotional clarity. But emotional inconsistency slowly becomes exhausting, especially for someone who keeps giving their heart completely. The empath grows tired of analyzing mixed signals, tired of waiting for emotional stability, tired of carrying conversations that should have been shared equally between two people. They begin realizing how much of their emotional energy has been spent trying to maintain a connection with someone who keeps stepping away whenever things become too emotionally real. And then something unexpected happens. The empath stops chasing answers. They stop asking where they stand. They stop seeking reassurance. They stop trying to convince someone to value them properly. Instead of focusing all their energy on the relationship, they begin turning inward. Their attention slowly returns to their own healing, their own peace, and their own emotional stability. The avoidant immediately feels this shift, even if they never say it openly. The emotional pattern they became comfortable with suddenly disappears. The person who once waited patiently is no longer waiting. The person who once adapted to every emotional distance is no longer adapting. And for the first time, the avoidant realizes the connection is no longer emotionally guaranteed. That realization creates deep uncertainty. Questions begin appearing in their mind. What if the empath is truly moving on? What if this silence is permanent? What if the emotional safety they depended on is disappearing forever? Meanwhile, the empath is finally experiencing something they lost a long time ago: peace. Not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped abandoning themselves just to keep someone else emotionally comfortable. They finally understand that real love should feel mutual, emotionally safe, and balanced instead of emotionally exhausting. At the end of every empath and avoidant relationship, one truth slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Most connections do not collapse because love completely disappears. They collapse because one person becomes emotionally exhausted from carrying the relationship alone for too long. And emotional exhaustion is dangerous because it rarely happens loudly. It builds silently over time through repeated disappointment, repeated emotional loneliness, and repeated moments of feeling unseen while continuing to give everything from the heart. The super empath does not suddenly wake up one day and stop caring. The process happens little by little. Every ignored emotion adds weight. Every moment of emotional withdrawal creates another invisible wound. Every time the empath must sacrifice their own peace just to maintain connection, something inside them slowly begins fading. Eventually, they realize they have spent years fighting emotional battles alone. They carried the difficult conversations. They repaired the silence. They gave patience during distance. They continued understanding even when their own needs remained unmet. And over time, the emotional burden becomes too heavy for one heart to hold. That is when the silence changes forever. Not the silence of anger, not the silence of manipulation, but the silence of acceptance. The empath finally understands they cannot heal a relationship without equal emotional effort from the other person. And once they reach that understanding, peace slowly begins replacing emotional chaos. The fear of losing the relationship weakens because the empath is no longer abandoning themselves just to keep another person emotionally comfortable. For the avoidant, this transformation feels deeply unsettling. The emotional certainty they once depended on suddenly disappears. The person who always stayed emotionally available is no longer chasing, no longer waiting, no longer carrying the connection alone. And for the first time, the avoidant fully recognizes the emotional value the empath quietly brought into their life all along. But by then, the empath is focused on something different, not saving the relationship at any cost, but finally saving themselves. They choose healing over emotional exhaustion, peace over confusion, and self-respect over endless sacrifice.